Welcome back to Speducation. I'm your host, Brandon Reed, and if this is your first time to the channel, a special welcome to you. Well, so far we've talked about how students feel, how they process information, strategies on how to help students process information, and how students visually perceive what it is that they see. What else is there? Well, there are actually a lot more hurdles that students with learning disabilities struggle with. And as I said last time, we're going to continue to talk about some of those hurdles and some of the ways to overcome them. So what is one of the hurdles that the students with learning disabilities are trying to overcome? Well, let's take a look at today's lesson and find out. Today's lesson in What Is It Like to Have a Learning Disability, we're going to be looking at Part 5, Reading Comprehension. Now, reading comprehension, that could mean a number of different things. If a student suffers from reading comprehension and they struggle with that, well, is it the reading that they struggle with? Is it the comprehension that they struggle with? If it's just reading comprehension, then what specifically in reading comprehension? Is it decoding the information? Maybe it's fluency. Maybe it's identifying important details or connections of thoughts. Whenever you're talking about reading comprehension as being a hurdle for a student to overcome, you have to be specific. That's why whenever I write IEPs and I write IEP goals for reading comprehension, I make sure that I specifically state what part of reading comprehension it is that the student is having difficulty with. So, when you say reading comprehension, make sure that you are specific. So today, let's be specific and talk about different things related to reading comprehension, okay, that individuals with learning disabilities have to overcome. Let's start by looking at a set of words. Do you understand the words in this list? Go ahead and take a look at these words, okay? And if you need to write them down, go ahead and pause the video and write them down. But you should know all of these words, or at least the majority of them. Did you understand the words on the list? If you said yes, then that's good. If there were some words that you weren't quite sure about, that's okay. But the majority of those words you should understand, correct? All right, let's see if that's true. Here's the passage that contains those words and only those words. Now, if you know those words, then you should know what this passage is talking about. Let's see if you do. To find the difference, we remove all of the elements of set B from set A. The resulting set consists of the remaining elements exclusive to set A. We read A minus B as A minus B. A minus B is a set obtained by eliminating the common elements between A and B from A. Did you understand this? What was it talking about? What particular subject do you think it's talking about? You knew all the words, right? So why would it be difficult to understand a statement containing only those words? That's because educators, not all of them, mind you, but a fair number of them, believe that if you understand the words that you see and you know the meaning of those words, it doesn't matter what kind of passage you're going to read them in, you'll understand it. And that's just not true, because comprehension has as much to do with background as vocabulary. If you know the vocabulary, that's great. But if you don't know the background of it, chances are you're not going to understand it. So, for example, in that passage, what was it talking about? Well, you probably said, well, I see that it's talking about sets. There are two sets there. There's A, there's B. It said A minus minus. Okay, so it had to do with minus. So minus, we use minus in math, we use it in science, but I didn't see any words that talked about science. So I'm thinking that it probably has to do with math. Good deductive reasoning. If that's what you were thinking, awesome job. Now, what in math does it pertain to? Well, that's where you probably get stuck. And what it's pertaining to is finding the range of the data in two sets, okay? But you didn't understand that. And again, it's because you probably didn't have a lot of background knowledge in it. I don't have a lot of background knowledge in math, and that's okay. But we're going to try something else. Now, you're going to watch a video from Mr. Lavoie. Remember, this whole series that I'm doing is based on a workshop called FAT City, F-A-T City, Frustration, Anxiety, and Tension. And it's based on the idea of giving individuals who've never had a learning disability so that they can understand what it's like to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. Now, in this video, Mr. Lavoie is going to read a story. The words in the story are completely made up and they make no sense whatsoever. But by the end of it, you should be able to answer some questions related to the story. So, are you ready for this activity? Let's see how you do.
Last Cerny, Flingeldope and Preben were in the Nerd Link, truckering gloopy caples and cleaning burly greps. Suddenly, a diddy struggle boofed into Flingeldope's tresk. Preben glaped and glaped. "Oh, Flingeldope," he chifed, "that duddy struzzle is tunning in your grep."
So how'd you do with the story? Were you able to follow it? Hopefully you were. Now, I have a few questions that I'm going to ask you related to the story, and hopefully you're able to answer them. Now, I've done this before, and I found that individuals that have listened to the story and then I asked these questions, they were able to pick it up very, very quickly. So hopefully you do, okay? So let me pull up the questions, and let's see how much you remember from that story. All right, here are the questions. Question number 1. When did the story take place? If you said last Cerny, you are correct. Question number 2. Who was with Flingeldope? If you said Preben, you are correct. Question number 3. Where were they? If you said in the Nerd Link, you are correct. Were you able to answer those questions? If yes, then great job, okay? But how were you able to answer those questions? Those words were completely made up. They had no meaning whatsoever. So how did you know? Well, it's because I asked specific questions related to the story. And your mind was able to figure out, okay, well, this question is related to who is the story talking about? This question is related to where was the story taking place? This question was asking, when did the story happen? And asking those specific questions, even though you didn't know the words at all, you were able to answer those. Whereas with the other passage, you knew every single word, but you couldn't tell me a thing about it because, again, you had no background knowledge. Just like you didn't have any background knowledge with this story that Mr. Lavoie was talking about. It was completely made up words, but I was asking specific questions. Without any background knowledge, you wouldn't be able to answer specific questions about math. You need that background knowledge. Reading comprehension is more than just understanding words. You knew nothing about the words in the story that Mr. Lavoie read, but you knew what was going on. The questions weren't necessarily about the meaning of the words, but what was happening in the story, as I said. Understanding reading comprehension can be confusing, but keep this in mind. You've got to be able to decode printed text and know what nearly all the words mean. But reading comprehension requires knowing a little, and sometimes a lot, about the topic you're reading about. This insight has been validated time and time again by cognitive science. This was from Robert Pundicio, and it was for an article on Forbes.com. So in summary, background knowledge is just as important as understanding the meaning of the words themselves. Because in today's times, reading comprehension isn't just tied to language arts anymore. In order for students to really develop those reading comprehension skills, they're going to learn the basics and the foundations in language arts, but it needs to be reinforced in other classes like science, social studies, math. And you're probably wondering, well, wait a second. How are they going to learn reading comprehension in math? It's math. There's no real reading in it. Well, think about this. Do you remember ever reading a story problem in math? Exactly. So in order to take the information in a story problem and write out a math problem, you have to understand what it is you're reading. And in order to solve a 1 or 2 step equation, you have to understand the rules. So if you're reading the definition or the steps and how to solve a two-step equation, it's probably important that you understand what you're reading, just like we did with that one passage. Now, we've talked a lot about the meaning of words and decoding, okay? We talked a little bit about fluency, but not so much, mainly about decoding and the meaning of words. So, what are we going to be learning about next week? Well, next week, we're probably not going to be learning about much because I'm not going to be here. That's right, because next week is spring break, at least for me. So the question should be, what are we going to be learning about in our next video? Well, let's take a look. Next week's lesson in What is it like to have a learning disability? We're going to be looking at part 6, reading and decoding. And if you liked what you saw or you learned something new today, please click the like button. And if you want updates on future videos, feel free to click the subscribe button and ring the bell for updates on future videos. And as always, if you have follow-up questions to today's video, or you have some comments or stories that you want to share with me, please feel free to leave those in the comments section. I would love to hear from you. And until next time, class dismissed.